Hello, everyone, and welcome to Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their advice. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode of Autism Stories, we are talking employment with Carly Fulgham, a process design manager at Bank of America. We discuss remote work, the interview process, and what makes some autistics good at process design. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Carly, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Wanted to start off like I do many of these episodes and learn, where does your story in the autism community begin?
Well, I had issues since I was a toddler. If you look at a list of a dozen or so early warning signs, I can check the box on all but two of them or type thing. But back in the 70s, they didn't consider autism for girls, especially if, like my speech issues were written off as cute and funny because I spent a year speaking in commercial jingles. So they just all thought it was a blast that they could ask me how I was and I'd say, have a Coke and a smile or something like that. And so the word autism didn't enter my life until in my mid-20s. I had a major burnout and I ended up on SSDI with major depressive disorder. So I just couldn't figure out why I couldn't figure out how to get along with people. And so I had a myriad of different jobs and a myriad of experiences in college and things like that. But it wasn't until I came across a magazine article about a little boy with autism that the light bulb went off when I realized that, it was almost describing me exactly. So I was able to get diagnosed from UCLA. Luckily, I was in California at the time, and they have great services out here, even for adults. And so I was able to get services to get back on my feet. And then about 6 years ago or so, I discovered volunteering. My employer highly encourages it. And at my second volunteer event, I walked up to a booth that was at the resource fair and found my local autism nonprofit. And that led to me becoming their president a few months later and joining a few other boards and museum advisory committees. And now I put in about 400 to 500 hours a year in volunteering for autism.
Things have definitely come a long way with diagnosis for women, but where do you think we are in terms of that? It seems like we still have a long way to go.
We do have a very long way to go. I know they're working on redefining the DSM and the ICD-10 for diagnosis criteria, but I don't think they're going. From what I've heard, they're not going to go far enough for women, even with that. I do a lot of giving advice on Facebook groups.
Right.
It's one of my little hobbies and so whenever I come across a woman who's looking for a diagnosis, I'm like, okay, tell me where you are. I'll check my list to see if I know someone who's competent in your area with diagnosing women, and make sure that you take your mask off, you be raw and you be real, and you really express your challenges. And the same goes for any adult trying to get into a diagnosis. We're so used to having to cover and hide our true selves just to get on in society that it's hard to remember that these people need to know your challenges. That's the important part of the diagnostic discussion.
Now, you're currently part of the document services strategy team at Bank of America. What's kind of the primary focus for you in that role?
Yeah. So, while I'm here, my opinions are my own and everything, but my day job is that I actually get paid to use my autistic brain. It's really awesome. I'm one of the lucky ones in that respect. So I've grown up over the years at the bank, we're going from smaller teams to bigger teams. And where I'm at now is the division that handles all paper and PDFs that all of Bank of America Merrill Lynch deals with, millions and millions of documents a year. And that's all the mail that goes out, all the letters that come in, forms, contracts, everything in that respect. And I'm one of a couple of people on the team who it's our job that whenever there's plans for next year, what we're going to do to improve processes or new projects that come along, that we sort out what's the strategy we want to take towards that to make sure that our customers and clients and our employees have the best experience they possibly can. And so it's just really fun because it's like getting paid to problem solve.
I think that many autistic people out there could thrive in process design.
Oh
How's
yeah.
how's being autistic made you better at your job?
Yeah, so it really comes down to just being wired differently. So I'm able to see the forest and the trees. I can find all the ways from A to Z that you can possibly imagine, and then some, because I actually can't turn it off. Like I sit at a stoplight and my brain tries to recalculate the timing of the lights to make traffic flow more efficiently. I look at your dishes in your dishwasher and I'm like, okay, if you just move this over here and this over here and this over here, you can fit 5 more dishes. So like my brain doesn't turn off process improvement. And so that's really a lot of what process design is, being able to understand your current state and see ways to improve from there.
Now, you started out at Bank of America in an entry level role, but management recognized your talent and moved you into a role that helped with issue resolution. In,
Yeah.
in some cases, management certainly doesn't recognize talents of autistic people. So, what suggestions do you have to people who want their supervisors to better understand their talents and help them advance in their careers?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to remember when it comes to your job is that they hired you because they believed you could do the job, but it's everything about you is really about them. So if you want to have an opportunity to work on that big project that your boss mentioned in the team meeting that was coming up, think about how you would be able to use your strengths to contribute it to make that project a success. So it's not about you getting the opportunity, it's about how could the project, how could the company reap benefit from your involvement. And so it's putting a little bit of a spin on how you communicate that. When you're talking to your manager about something as simple as participating in team meetings, if you want to make sure that you are fully understanding what's being said, despite the clicking of the air conditioner, the fluorescent lights, the people tapping their pens on the table, all those distractions that are going on in the room that can cause you to miss it. You don't want to go to your manager and say, after every meeting, I didn't catch everything that you said. Can you tell me again? Because that's taking away from their bandwidth and their ability to do their job. But what you can do is, voluntarily say to your manager, I process things a little bit differently, and I want to make sure that we're always on the same page so that I can succeed in everything that you're talking about. Can I do a synopsis of what I thought went on in the meeting, and you can take a peek at it and let me know if I missed anything? Because that's a lot less effort for the manager than having to completely recap for an entire meeting twice.
What if your synopsis is pretty far off from what like the manager or supervisor would come up
Then
with?
it's a learning experience. The first time, the second time, the third time, each time it'll get better. Because you'll be looking at the meeting from a different paradigm as well. Like if you declare yourself the official note taker, you can take all the notes you want, process it later, have as much time as you want to process the information, and then gradually you'll get more experience with that and get to the point where you're able to pick things up faster.
So since the pandemic, I've moved a lot more of my work to remote, and I don't want to go back to what it was pre-pandemic, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. So I know
Yeah,
you've worked remotely, I believe, for the last 8 years at Bank of America. Um,
yeah,
so you have kind of a lot of experience with this remote work. What's that process been like? How has that helped you
yeah,
to be
yeah.
successful at Bank of America?
Yeah, so I started off on a team 8 years ago that was 100% remote because everybody was spread out all over the country, and so everybody was just working remotely because if you went into an office, there would be nobody there for you to talk to anyway. And so then things have changed, and they I was going to have to go into the office, and I got to thinking about my last experience in an office, and I'm like, it was at a time when we had mandatory overtime dealing with some big projects, and so I remember, everybody else would go in 2 hours early, and so they could be home with their families in the evenings, and that was before I had my son. So I'm like, no, 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 I'll stay late because I always think better in the evenings anyway. I'm not a morning person at all. So thank you for scheduling this in the afternoon. but but basically, I found that I was getting like my 8 hours of work done in the 2 hours at night when everybody else was gone. And then and it was early on in my understanding of autism. I was still learning a lot about it, and I found that I realized that I had a zillion sensory issues. Like it never had occurred to me before. I just assumed before that everybody else experienced the world that way, and just figured out how to deal with it. And then I realized, wait, no, that was a sensory issue. That was a sensory issue. That time that my coworker was scouring her desk constantly with Lysol, and it made me want to throw up. Like, yeah, that was a sensory issue. It was one of those things where that really made me realize I need to not go into the office to continue to be able to be productive and to continue to be able to do my job. And so I was able to work with the accommodations team at the company to sort out an accommodation. And for my particular role, noise canceling headphones weren't really practical because I had to be on conference calls all day, every day. The level at the company that I am, my desk would be in a cubicle, giant room full of cubicles. The walls on the cubicles weren't that high, across the sea of cubicles. So, really for the company, the best accommodation was to have me work from home. But I've always caveated that with, okay, if everybody's getting together for a big meeting, I'm going to come in. I'll if they're going to do we have teleconference rooms for the company that you can go in and have it's like a conference room with a giant video screen. And so I would be like, okay, if you're going to have a telepresence, I'm going in. So even though I was work from home, I myself would make exceptions to that just to be able to have some of that community. And like some of my colleagues in technology in a local office would invite me in for the potluck once a month and things like that. Because I do think it's good to have that interaction, but from a day-to-day basis, I really needed to have that work from home.
Now, the interview is one of the first steps to employment, but in the vast majority of cases, interviews are not geared to highlight the abilities of neurodivergent folks. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages if more interviews in the future are done remotely?
I think that would be a huge win for our community. One of the biggest things about like Zooms and whatnot is nobody expects you to look them in the eye. And in order for it to look like you're looking them in the eye, you're actually not looking at them in the eye, you're looking at the camera. So I have to remind myself that when I'm trying to do a selfie, I'm like, don't look at myself in the picture, look up at the camera, because otherwise it looks like you're looking down or something. So it also a big factor that a lot of people don't think about is that it eliminates anxiety over the environment. because ahead of time, ahead of the interview, you may not even realize that you're doing it, but you're thinking, okay, is this going to be in a giant room with 100 people? Is this going to be in a break room? Is this going to be in a private office? What's the color of is it going to be freshly painted? I'm going to have to deal with that smell. Is it going to be a color that I can't handle? Like, so many factors that go into it, especially with sensory issues. If you're doing a remote interview, you can control your environment.
Yeah.
And that's really huge. Even better, I think, are phone-only interviews, because then there's no camera at all. And so that my company does a lot of those where it's just phone only.
Yeah.
The job that I'm in right now, I just moved into this role at the beginning of the year, and my interview was phone only.
I think knowing as many expectations as possible. I mean, interviews are already like anxiety provoking just because they're interviews, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I do workshops on accommodations, and people often ask me about accommodations during the interview process, and I'm like, if you can avoid it, that's always great. But I don't see why you can't ask, where are we going to be interviewing? Can you describe the room to me just so I can be prepared? I know it's probably a very uncommon question, but if I were a recruiter or a manager, I'd be like, oh, well, yeah, we're going to be in my office, and so or whatever.
Diversity and inclusion initiatives seem to not only be growing at workplaces, but many times these initiatives are not including the hiring and retention of disabled people. You recently received a diversity inclusion certificate from Cornell, so I'm really interested to learn about this. What did you learn from this experience? Was disability included as part of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up, because I have an expression. I say that disability is the last piece of the diversity and inclusion puzzle.
Yeah.
Because so many of the other so many of the other civil rights movements have come before us, and I feel like we're the last ones at the table. But yeah, I actually approached the certificate program intentionally through the lens of disability. And so a lot of the content was related to things like unconscious bias and other things that are kind of universal across the affinity groups. But they did definitely speak about disability. But whenever I was doing an assignment, I made sure to do it through that disability lens, so that I could learn practically how am I going to apply what I learned to my advocacy that I do, and the work I do inside and outside of my company, to make sure that everybody feels welcome and included. And so I got some great feedback and comments back from the instructor, and so it was and also the classmates as well. When we did a group conversation, it was really refreshing to see so many people appreciate my perspective.
Now, beyond Bank of America, you are on the board of directors for the Autism Society of America and a chair for the panel of people on the spectrum. Can you talk a little bit about the Autism Society and specifically what this panel does?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, ASA has been around for over 65 years, and while it did start out as an organization founded by parents, it's really evolved into focusing on the entire lifespan for people on the spectrum, and making sure that so you got a diagnosis, now what? And so we have a network of affiliates around the country, and my panel is a wide variety of people on the spectrum, and we have a couple of main things that we do. We help the national board and staff when they have questions or need advice on something. We participate in task forces, committees, things like that, to make sure that our voice is heard in everything the organization does. I've even consulted with the individual affiliates on how to have more people on the spectrum engaged in their leadership roles and whatnot. And then there's a couple of us that are actually on the board of directors, and it's not a token thing at all. We we fully contribute. Lars is our secretary of the board, and then I'm on the board as well as in my chair position, and so I really love one of our core tenets is our options policy, and that we say it's up to you to figure out what's best for your family and what's best for your situation. We'll help you learn what all the options are, but we're not going to tell you to do this or that, because we're like my local affiliate. We do things like art classes for kids, art classes for young adults. I do twice a year work in college accommodations workshop, more about practical things that in your community. We want to start a cooking class this year. That's another thing.
And I think it's so important that there's more autistic people on nonprofit boards. I know you mentioned, we're not a token because a lot of times that is the case. Do you have any advice for nonprofits in terms of bringing more autistic people on the boards and getting their advice and on a daily basis? You should be asked your advice all the time.
Yeah, well, and also look at staff too. I mean, both my local and our national have people with autism on staff too. So it's not just in the leadership roles. But what I would say, if you are a nonprofit and you want to have more people with any type of disability or autism specifically on your board, you need to think of really two things. First of all, presume competence. We are competent just like anybody else. Some of us may be slower to speak or need an assistive technology or need some other type of accommodation. Like there's ways to even do pictorial agendas so that someone who can't read can fully participate in your board meeting. There's lots of different ways to do accommodations. But the other big thing is, I think, just remembering that accommodations might not just be in the day-to-day operations. Like a lot of people with disabilities, especially in some of the bigger voices in our community, they're not holding down a day job. Their job is to go out and, do public speaking and, run these amazing Facebook groups that connect our community. And those emerging leaders are more than likely actually underemployed or unemployed from a traditional job standpoint. And so if they're willing to volunteer their time to be on your board, perhaps don't have a give or get policy for them. Because one of the biggest things that I think is a hurdle for people with disabilities in general, not just people with autism, is that we are expected to contribute everything for free for the privilege of helping. But when it comes to board service, a lot of times there's an expectation that you do fundraising for the board. Like if you're having trouble putting food on your table, don't ask me to raise $1 million for your organization.
Right.
So if you truly value their input, consider their input to your organization an in-kind donation. Because that's truly what it is. It breaks my heart when I hear some of our both at my local level and the international level, some of our greatest minds living out of their cars, because they've contributed so much to the movement, but they can't support themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's some great advice. Carly, I really appreciated your time today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, anytime.
Thanks to everyone for listening, and thanks so much to Carly for the conversation. In the podcast description of this episode, you can find a link to book a call to learn how Autism Personal Coach helps people in so many different ways in the employment process, whether it's helping people figure out a job that's right for them, making sure their resumes are appropriate for the job they're applying for, coaching you through the job process, or making sure you're prepared for interviews, or even supporting you following up with supervisors once you're hired as long as needed. Because it's not easy to find a job, but it's much harder to keep that job. So book a call with me today. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We'd also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On next week's episode of Autism Stories, we will have a conversation about self-advocacy. Talk to you then.